are meant to stay in the Middle East. The family dynasty that controlled Syria for more than half a century is no longer in power, with President Bashar al-Assad having fled the country as rebel forces closed in on the capital, Damascus.
December 8th. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is reported to have fled the country his family has ruled over for 50 years. The news is a political earthquake, sending shockwaves across the globe. Miles away in Europe, thousands of Syrians in the diaspora come together in spontaneous gatherings to mark this historic moment. European governments are quick to respond too, many freezing asylum claims from Syrians and some even drafting plans for the return of refugees. In this two-part episode, we first speak with Alaa Same, a Syrian refugee now settled in Norway. He shares his extraordinary story of escaping Syria, finding his way to Oslo, and the moment he learned that the dictator who had ruled his country for decades was finally gone. We then turn to two leading experts on migration and refugees. Marta Bivand Erdal, research professor in migration studies at PRIO, joins us alongside Pål Nesse, senior advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council. I am Arno Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Alaa, welcome to this episode. Can you start by introducing yourself, your name, age, and occupation?
My name is Alaa Same. I'm 34 now, and I work as a consultant in a consulting company here in Norway.
When and how did you first come to Norway?
It was, as far as I remember, it was 2014. I came here as a refugee illegally through the Mediterranean Sea from Libya.
Can you tell us about what was your life like in Syria before you left? What did you do and what led you to leave?
So I was an activist when the revolution started in Damascus. I'm from a place called Al-Midan. It's in the middle of Damascus, and it was one of the first places that started demonstrating against al-Assad regime in Syria. So I was like, as all of youth, young people in Syria, very excited, and we want to change this regime because we heard that it happened in Tunisia and in Egypt. So
the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring, exactly. So we have had that hope that, okay, if they could do it, we can do it. So we started like the activism and start arranging for different demonstrations in different places and areas in Damascus. But we wasn't ready for what happened after that because the regime was very brutal, and I knew that I'm on the wanted list, so I have to run away.
You said you left Syria via Libya. Other Syrians took different routes. Many went north through Turkey, for example. How did you end up in Libya?
Yeah. So first of all, I think like the same day or the day after that I was on the wanted list. So I was very, very lucky. They were not yet spreading my name on the borders. So I went out of Syria legally to Egypt, take the plane to Egypt. But lately I knew that the people who was on the same list, on the same reason with me, they were tortured to death. Two of them, I know them. So they were captured by the regime and they were tortured to death there. So I'm very lucky, but I always feel like, yeah, why me? If you understand my feeling. So yeah, I went out of Syria legally to Egypt, and then I started my trip to Libya illegally because at that time there were no regime in Libya. It was like a country without ruler.
That the central government.
Yeah, nothing. So if you want to go there, you go there illegally.
And did you leave your family behind in Syria?
Of course. I mean, there's no options. Usually in Syria, when you are boy, it's most risky being a boy in Syria. For girls, it's less because we, the boys who go out and demonstrate, and we who is usually wanted to serve the military as well, like for the regime. So you are either an activist against the regime or serving the regime. So there is no other choices.
No in between.
No in between. So I think this why a lot of like the majority of Syrian people here in the diaspora, boys, comparing to like the numbers between boys and girls. So I think it's important to mention I was forced out of Libya. I lived there for 3 years. But because of the situation in Libya as well, it was war. I was kidnapped twice there, one of them by ISIS.
Wow.
Trying to convince me to go back to Syria and fight with them. And like a week before I left Libya, it was a huge war between two different militias there in Tripoli, in the capital. So for me, I was thinking, I left Syria to be safe. So I'm here is like the situation in Libya was worse than what was in Syria. So I decided to take the chance.
So Europe wasn't even your really first destination when you left Syria?
No. Okay. So here is an important thing for like to understand for Syrian people. When we go out of Syria, we don't decide where to go. We just run out of Syria because of the situation. We are like, you have two options, either to die there or to run away. So we only run away without deciding where to go. And when we feel safe, then we start thinking what to do or where to go or where I could be able to go. So that's very important thing because I think a lot of people think, okay, we sit in Syria having a hubble bubble, a shisha, and dreaming about where to go and how to go. It's not like that. We leave our home because it's destroyed.
Circumstances basically will decide where you go.
Yeah.
So you're in Libya and you see this is not a safe place for you. And that's when you took the decision to go to Europe. Tell us about how you crossed the Mediterranean.
When we went out of Libya, in the boat, we had, I don't know what they call them, hackers. They like came after us in the sea. The same smugglers who like put us in the boat. After half an hour or 1 hour, they came after us, like covering their faces and trying to steal everything from us. What happened for me, I refused to give them my money and my cell phone because I felt like I'm losing my dignity if I give them anything. So I decided to throw everything in the sea, my money and everything. I told them, if you want it, go and get it. So, and they stabbed me with a knife in my shoulder, but it went okay. So
you crossed the Mediterranean basically with a wound.
Yeah, it wasn't that dangerous. So it was very okay. But when I arrived in Italy, suddenly I knew, okay, I have no money. How to continue the trip?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was there for like basically 1 month or a bit more, trying to find out a way to continue, until I find some people helped me, and I found a good smuggler who took me from Italy to Nice in France.
That's where I'm from.
Yes, that's where we're from. And actually, Nice is a really nice city.
So I've heard.
Yeah. So yeah, from there we took a plane to Denmark with my Syrian passport. That was very, very shocking for me that he is really good. I can travel with my Syrian passport.
No borders. Schengen.
Yeah, Schengen, exactly. To Denmark, and from there to take like the train to Malmö. And again, when I arrived in Malmö, I arrived there with zero money. Everything I've like given to the smuggler. So I was sitting in the metro station or the bus station thinking about, should I apply for like asylum here in Sweden, or how can I continue to Norway? Going around and thinking and trying to find out a solution, because when I was in Italy, I was like doing some researches about European country, and I found out that, okay, Norway are really good with skydiving. And I like that. So I was thinking, okay, I should go to Norway so I can do skydiving there.
That answers my question, like why Norway specifically?
Exactly.
Okay.
No, actually, two things: the skydiving and the work market was like I was like yeah. During my research, found out that okay, the work market is good.
Job market, yes.
Yeah, the job market. Yeah, so I found a Syrian guy there in the station who was like looking at me, and he told me like, I'm not gonna go home and think about you and like feel bad for you. I will pay for your ticket so you can go to Oslo.
Wow.
Yeah, so he paid for my ticket to Oslo, and then I arrived here.
Back to Syria a little bit. You were there on December 9th, a day after the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapsed.
Yeah.
And reports emerged that he had fled the country after over 2 decades in power. Take us back to that day. Where were you? What were you doing? And what was your reaction when you learned that he had fled?
First of all, I was very, very, very lucky because it was my vacation. So my vacation started 7th of December, and I was on my way to Indonesia to enjoy the weather and
Escape the Norwegian winter.
Weather, exactly. And my plan was being there, like going to Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia and going like a whole trip. So on the way, I arrived in Dubai, and al-Assad fell. And I was like whole the night. I couldn't sleep because watching the news and stressing the whole time during the trip. And my uncle is living in Dubai, so I was at his place when the regime collapsed. So I was talking to my uncle, and I told him 7th at night, if until tomorrow al-Assad regime collapse, I'm gonna change my plan. So he looked at me and he started smiling. He told me, bro, it's al-Assad regime. He survived for 14 years. What are you talking about? So he was just making like a joke of me. So I told him, okay, we will see. The day after, 6:18 in the morning, we hear the news, Syria without Bashar al-Assad. For me, it was a moment I could never forget in my lifetime. It's crazy. Nobody knew it. Nobody predicted. Nobody was near to think about it, because we knew during those 14 years how it was and how brutal it was. After I wake up from this shocking moment, at 8 o'clock, I started looking for flight tickets. I booked the ticket to Amman, and the plan was to continue by car to Damascus. But the border was closed at night, so you can't go there. And the news was they closed the border, and we don't know when they would open it. So my uncle in Dubai told me, why are you going? You are wasting your money and time. The border is closed. So I told him, I'm gonna go there. If they open the border, I would go in. If they wouldn't, I would spend my time there in Amman. I don't care. I will try. I'm gonna try. So after arguing half an hour, he told me, okay, you are hopeless. Let's drive you to the airport. And the day after in Amman, or the same day, I asked around, can I go to the borders? Everyone telling me, no, you can't. It's closed. You can't do that. So I waited to the day after. In the morning, I went to the
that's the 8th of December?
The 9th of December.
The 9th of December.
Yeah, so, in the morning. So I want to try to find a way to go to the borders, because there is kind of an hour between Amman and Jabr, the border of Syria. Everyone I'm meeting in the street trying to get to the border, they always telling me, you can't go there, it's closed, and you are wasting your time. And I was always insisting, no, get me there and put me there, and I will go back walking if they wouldn't allow me in. I need to do it. So yeah, finally there were a taxi driver. He told me, okay, if you give me money, I will drive you. So I said, thank you. Do that.
And he drove you to the border.
He drove me to the border.
So you get to the border, and what happens next?
There I found a bus was trying to enter to the Syrian side. I asked him, please take me with you. He told me, I have no place. The bus is full. So now I knew, when I get there, I knew that the border is open, but people is talking about it's closed. It's because they don't know. Yeah. So he told me, the bus is full, you can't. I told him, do whatever. I can do whatever you want. If you want, put me in the luggage room, on the top of the bus, wherever you want, just take me with you. So he started thinking a little bit, and he told me, okay, the place next to him, which is to his assistant, you can use it. And he told me, okay, you can sit next to me. If anybody asks you, you told them you are my assistant. I told him, perfect. It's a dreamy place because I'm sitting in the front. I can see the whole street, everything around me. I told him, okay.
Front row seats.
Yeah, they're like VIP. Yeah, so yeah, of course I paid, and I went to stamp my passport. So they found out, okay, you are not Syrian, and only Syrian people are allowed to go into Syria now. It's Norwegian passport. So I told him, but in the passport, it's written that my birth is in Syria. He told me it wouldn't help a lot. So he asked his boss. So his boss asked me, where is your Syrian passport? Do you have any Syrian document? I told him, look at me. 13 years ago, I was sinking in the sea, trying to escape from Syria. Luckily, I managed to survive, but my passport didn't manage. It's in the sea.
It sank in the sea.
Yeah. So he just looked at me and told his colleague, just stamp it. So he stamped my passport and I went in.
And I'm assuming you drove straight to your family that you hadn't seen in 13 years?
Yes. The thing is, going into Syria was like very big momentum. It's very stressing because it was a moment we were dreaming about for the last 13 years. And it was always scary thinking about going there. I'm there in the day after, so I don't know if the news is right or it's false news. Al-Assad regime is still in control in Damascus and in Syria. It was a really huge risk, but I wasn't able to. My body is pushing me to go there.
Describe for us, what was the atmosphere in Syria after you managed to re-enter?
Yeah. First impression for me, when the bus driver was about to cry, I looked at him and I asked him, what's happening? You are a big, tough guy. You are about to cry. What's happening? He asked me, do you see this checkpoint? I told him, yes. He told me, we use to wait here for 5, 6, 7 hours, dehumanized, before we could pass this checkpoint. So it's unbelievable to just pass through it without any problem. So that described to me how horrible life was there in Syria for Syrians who were there the whole time.
And how big of a sudden shift this was.
Exactly.
In the moment.
Yeah. And before meeting my family, when we arrived in Damascus and I want to go to my home, the street was almost empty because people still afraid of what's happening. You know, it's a new day and nobody know what's going around. So people hiding themselves in their houses.
How was it for you seeing your family again after 13 years?
That's exactly this. I guess it's indescribable. Because until now, I'm thinking about this moment. I couldn't find any word that could describe how nice, how good, how peaceful it was. It was, I mean, we could write a book about it, only about this moment.
Mm-hmm.
When my family knew that, because they didn't know, I didn't tell them anything until I entered the borders.
Mm-hmm.
So I posted something on Instagram and I was thinking if they see my Instagram, they would know that I'm on my way. If they didn't see it, it becomes a surprise. So they knew that. And it was about an hour before I arrived. And that was really shocking for me that in this 1 hour, they could call all of my family, my uncles, aunts, my grandma and everyone from different places in the city. They gathered at my family's house, and they as well managed to call what's called orchestra band to celebrate my
What a homecoming for you.
Yeah, and for me, I wasn't expecting all of that in 1 hour, but when I arrived, everything was settled. As it's a huge party.
Welcoming you back home.
Yeah, it was overwhelming.
I can only imagine. And as you know, governments in Europe reacted quickly to the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and several European countries suspended asylum claims for Syrians almost immediately.
Yeah.
And some conservative politicians in countries like Germany and Austria proposed returning Syrians living in Europe, even offering financial incentives. What do you make of this?
I think that's very silly. I mean, like talking about that or thinking about that, there is different concerns we can think about here. There is a legal concern, there's a moral concern, there's a humanitarian concern. So I don't know, like when thinking about returning refugees back to Syria, based on what they're doing that. Like when we think about freezing the asylum claims here in Europe, do they know about the security and the stability in Syria? It just like happened. We know nothing yet. We don't know if it's gonna collapse again or the new regime is gonna be like worse than al-Assad regime or not. How could they like make this decision really quick? That's ununderstandable for me. As well as we are thinking about the new government in Syria, the new leaders. They were running a small city called Idlib. Okay, and then out of the sudden, in 11 days, they have control all of the whole country of Syria. Do they have the capacity to serve the whole Syria? I don't think so, and I don't think politicians here in Europe are really silly to believe in that. So we know the regime collapsed. Everything, like the whole regime collapsed. Not like in Egypt or in Tunisia, only the top of the regime. No, in Syria, the whole of it, from bottom to the top. Nothing, no police officers, no healthcare, nothing that's linked to the previous regime is operating. And now it's a new government that was running a small city, gonna run the whole of Syria. They don't have capacity, they don't have resources to do that. Another thing to think about, what the Western media is doing now, they are usually going to Damascus, taking some videos from there and talking to people in Damascus and like publishing it here in Europe as it's all of Syria is Damascus. Damascus is a small part of Syria and it's safe because it's the capital and it's always the nicest place to be in. But that doesn't represent the whole Syria. If you go out like 10 minutes out of Damascus, you would start seeing really different reality. So I think they are making their decision not based on reality, but based on the political atmosphere here. So we know that the right wing is growing, and now it's a really, really good card to play with, the refugees.
Finally, I want to ask you, Alaa, what are your hopes for the future, for yourself and for Syria?
What do I hope for Syria? I mean, a new Syria. I don't actually dream to have a new Japan in the Middle East, like comparing Syria to Japan, or a new Germany in the Middle East, comparing Syria to Germany after the World War. I don't like to have like a new Singapore. It's not my dream. My dream is having a new Syria. I mean, we should always remember that we are like the start of the civilization started from Syria. You are talking about a 9,500 years old civilizations, continuous. Like you are talking about like fascinating place. So I wouldn't think about comparing Syria to any other rebuilding country or city in the world. I would like to have my own Syria, new Syria, like Syria that represent the identities, different groups. Justice is really important for the future.
Alaa, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story.
Thank you.
Marta, Pål, welcome to this episode. Marta, we just heard the extraordinary story of Alaa and what the sudden fall of the Assad regime meant to him. And it is no understatement to say that this political earthquake sent shockwaves through Europe almost immediately after the news broke. How would you describe the broader implications of the collapse of the Assad regime on the refugee debate in Europe?
Thanks, Arnold. So I think, first of all, of course, it's still very early days. And I think the salience here is for Syria, for Syrians within Syria as well as abroad. And it's about democracy, freedom, protection of minority rights in Syria. There are so many big questions at the moment. So earthquake, I think, is an appropriate term. Now, in terms of the implications for the refugee debate in Europe, I think, first of all, it's a challenge because it's so overheated. And it sort of leans in a very nativist direction in general, rather than maybe more in an international solidarity among humans direction. That said, I do think there are reasons to stop and think and try and see, okay, so what were these initial reactions about? And I think maybe there are three brief points I can mention. So first of all, I think the question about whether protection is needed or not is fair to ask. If we then know that, like Alaa, people were, running for their lives because of a regime where we know people were tortured to death. Now, if that regime is gone, okay, so what is the implication for that in terms of protection needs? I think it's important to recognize that that's not an unfair question to ask. So that's the first point. Then the second one, which I think we need to be able to have in our minds at the same time, is about timing. And of course, what is going to happen in Syria now is incredibly hard to assess. It's very early days. It's very unstable at the moment. So that's the second point. And the third and last one, I think, in particular in the European context, is important to think about is in relation to the individual people, because we're not talking about flows, we're talking about people. And I think Alaa is a good example of this. You have a young adult who left Syria as a very young person in his early 20s. So what is the period from 2011 to 2025 look like, and what does it mean for individuals in terms of their lives? And in terms of questions of return. And that's going to be individual, it's going to be different. And I don't think it's fair also to not acknowledge the fact that these are individual considerations also when it comes to these human beings. And many of them are, in fact, now also citizens in Europe. So I think the debate is legitimate, but I think it's also important to consider it from these multiple perspectives.
Pål, you have decades of experience in refugee advocacy and support. You bring exceptional insights into the humanitarian needs and rights of refugees. How do you view the current push by conservative parties in Europe to return Syrian refugees to Syria?
It is definitely premature. As Marta said, the situation is very unpredictable. It may vary in different parts of Syria, and it's far too early to determine whether it's safe to go back or not. And then we should also remember that rights, again, are individual, they're not collective. Syrians mostly have been here for quite a while, they've been established. But we should also, and that is something we haven't done for so many years, develop good return policies. Because there's been very little return of refugees in the last 25 years because of all the conflicts we've had. And so few have seen positive steps, like we hope we see now. So I think it's time to lean back, be careful about determining, and look at what are the good options we can apply to refugees being able to return or not.
Marta, here in Europe, much of this discussion feels like a Europe-centric debate. And if you're in the US, this will feel like a domestic issue too. President Donald Trump just suspended the nation's refugee resettlement program and is pressing ahead with his deportation plans. But the majority of displaced Syrians are, of course, internally within Syria and in neighboring countries such as Turkey. Why is this important to remember, in your view?
So I think, it's obviously important to remember, and I think also to note from a research perspective, that this is about facts on the ground, so to speak, and this is reflected in much of the research that we do at PRIO around the world, in unfortunately many conflict settings, of course, and also hopefully those transitioning into peace as well. So why it's important is because that's where the majority of people are. So Syrians within Syria, like you mentioned, internally displaced, around 7 million. We know that Syria was a country that before 2011, many people were living very good, dignified lives and not in poverty. At the moment, the numbers are terrible in terms of how many people are living under the poverty line, both those who have been displaced and who haven't. So I think it's about kind of keeping an eye on where the facts are and what is, just in terms of numbers, the important stuff. But in terms of the mobility and refugees and the questions then broader of return as well, why it matters, of course, because internally displaced people will also want to try and go back if they can. Again, many of them have been moving around or have been in a particular place now maybe for 5-10 years. So is that their home? Or is the initial home they had before where they somehow should go back? What if that is completely bombed and destroyed and does not exist anymore? So it really goes to profound questions of how we see mobility, how we see whether people should go back where they belong, or whether where people's lives are now, where they've rebuilt them, is where they can live. And those questions are transposable to an extent, I think, also more broadly. But I think the regional aspect is maybe really important to dwell with as well. So we know that about maybe 6 million refugees from Syria have left the country, and the vast majority of those are in the neighboring countries, so Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, also Iraq and Egypt. Now, as I mentioned those countries, I think we all know, just thinking about the news from 2024, that these were not all peaceful, stable, prosperous countries, say in 2024. So we already know that many Syrians who were in Lebanon were coming back well before the fall of Assad's regime in 2024. We're talking not many in terms of millions, but many in terms of thousands. Why? I don't think that was in terms of what Pål was discussing as, good options for a safe, dignified return. Maybe more less worse, maybe possible to survive rather than die type of options. So yes, an option to return, but certainly not in a dignified manner that we would hope people were able to do. And that is already going on. And it's important to stress also because this is not unique to Syria. The fact that people are displaced internally and also in the region, and that there are mobilities across these borders within the conflict context, as there is sort of stability without war, but not really peace. This is quite common. People try and assess what are our options, what should we do. It matters a lot whether you're traveling alone or with children. Very, very human considerations that all of us would make, and people are making them, whatever policymakers in Europe or elsewhere might be thinking. And this is massively going on in the region primarily, which is why it's important to focus on it.
Pål, I'd like you to wear your Norwegian Refugee Council hat for us and give us an assessment of the conditions on the ground. And keeping in mind, Syria is still under enormous sanctions by the EU, the US, the UK. You said earlier that the whole debate around returns is premature. So is Syria ready to receive large numbers of returning refugees?
On the ground, not. But at the same time, we should also be aware that often you will find, as Marta was saying, that people start returning because in the neighboring countries, very many are in quite a predicament, in a difficult situation. So they may want to go back, even though it is not safe and conditions are not good. So what we should do now is to lift as many of the sanctions as possible, maintain a good dialogue with the new regime, and assist those that, despite the difficulties, go home. Because one of the things we depend on, and which is good also for Europe, is that the situation becomes more stable, is that people who do return find it okay, they manage. And for that to happen, and we hear that now, people are returning, the houses have been destroyed, the school is closed, there's no health, it's hard to find income. So assistance, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, development is essential. And because we were so hesitant to do this when Assad was in power, we should now change that policy as soon as possible.
Marta, based on your research at PRIO, what factors should policymakers consider before making decisions about returning Syrian refugees, or any refugee for that matter?
So first of all, I think more generally in terms of return migration, and we've done some research on this at PRIO in the past, despite what one might assume, there are some parallels between all contexts of migration, whether they are in conflict contexts or more or less peaceful contexts. And the basic rule, rather unsurprisingly, is that some people return, others don't. That's generally true. Now, that doesn't really tell us so much, right? Because we're interested in the proportions here. So their research would tell us two basic things, which again are maybe not so surprising. The longer people stay out of the country, the fewer go back, briefly speaking. And also, the further they go, the harder for them to maybe go back. So in a way, the closer they go, the higher the chances they will come back. All this, I think, is fairly intuitive, and it largely also holds in context of post-conflict reconstruction. Although there, of course, the political stability and economic situations people would have would, of course, like in any other context, be extremely important and often be difficult to assess again. But I think these things are really important sort of knowledge that we have about return, which we should not assume is any different in the Syrian context. Now, as both Pål and I think have mentioned, this is a rather long-term situation, although in terms of global displacement, it sadly isn't that long. We have cases which are far longer already in terms of being protracted. But still, as I mentioned before, depending on your age in 2011 is quite a long time. So I think already it is quite long. And we know that in terms of return, it's longer than the situations where most people would probably go back. And just also to sort of say a few words about the refugee context specifically in relation to return. So I think it's, like Pål mentioned, worth noting that the situation in the 1990s was that the UNHCR had huge repatriation programs. We had years in the 1990s with up to 3.5 million people being repatriated. Not necessarily with full voluntariness and agency among all of them necessarily, but these were situations often in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa of sort of large-scale displacement and also opportunities for return after there was a relative peace of sorts and people could go back. Now, that changed entirely, and I think 2002 was the year where we had the highest numbers of repatriation kind of in the 2000s, and now that's changed. And until 2022, the numbers were less than 500,000 refugee returns as recorded by UNHCR, which is not everything, but it is the numbers that we have. And I think it's likely that we hopefully are seeing a change there. Because after all, and I think this is important also to focus on in the European context with this debate, which is sometimes not always very helpful, that many refugees don't want anything else but to be able to go back. And for the ones for whom that is their hope and life dream, what we should focus on is how we can support that. And I think there in the European context, we need to do maybe what Pål is thinking, ask some brave questions that are tough to ask in the current climate, but they're necessary. And at the same time, we need to think in parallel, what could refugees that are far away in Europe and who have citizenship in European countries really do to help? And I think there are two key words that I want to mention here. One is remittances. We know that remittances are a lifeline for many people in vulnerable situations, in disasters. And this goes for people who are internally displaced but have relatives abroad. Many of them survive thanks to remittances. What happens if those remittances stop? They're not going to be replaced by other funds coming from elsewhere. So I think that's a serious question to ask and to really take seriously. And the second aspect is diaspora. So what can diaspora organizations collectively do to help in reconstruction? Is the best thing really to make sure that they go back and take the jobs? Or could we have programs where diaspora members could, on a voluntary basis, during their holidays, which many people would be willing to do, go back and help, teach, as engineers, as IT experts, in whatever professions they have, having gained those skills elsewhere, really contributes to rebuilding a peaceful Syria. And we know from other contexts that when programs exist for that, that helps.
And this fits right into our experiences for those of us that actually did work on the large return movements in the 1990s. And that was first, return should remain voluntary. If you own your own decision, then you're so much more likely to have a safe and well-functioning return and not do your best to try to flee again as soon as you get back. Second, you need to be informed. You need to know and be prepared that things are going to be difficult. And another third option, which you also mentioned, is you should not lose your rights in the country of asylum, whichever that is in Europe. And again, as was also mentioned, most Syrians came to Europe in 2013, 14, 15, 16. Very many have citizenship or other permanent permissions to remain, and they should be kept. But if you are permitted to go and see, and very often the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees would organize that in previous return situation. You go and see one from the family, for instance, and then you know a little bit more. Then you can try, you can test, but you also don't need to make that existential choice. Should I stay where I am safe now, or should I take the chance of returning to Syria? have the option of trying and come back to Norway, UK, Germany, wherever. If it doesn't work, then the chance that you will try to make a successful return is so much higher. And that would be in the interest of Syria, of the host countries such as ours, and of course particularly the refugees themselves.
Pål, you mentioned the number of refugees, and you've been vocal in Norway, particularly recently, saying the country should accept even more refugees. And this is at a time where, as you both alluded to, many places in Europe are seeing pretty strong anti-immigration sentiment, more and more popular, right? In Norway, there are national elections coming up this year, and the Progress Party is leading in the polls. And for our listeners, the leader of the Progress Party, Sylvi Listhaug, made international headlines in 2016 when she famously jumped off a Norwegian rescue vessel in an orange wetsuit in the Mediterranean to see what it's like to be a refugee. So, Pål, I'd like to ask you why you think the number of refugees in Norway should increase, and is this audible at the moment in the current political climate?
Well, the debate we've had recently is about resettlement. And it is the debate we're now seeing in the US, as you mentioned. Norway used to resettle 3,000. It's now been going down to 500. And that's a very low number. And these, we must remember that resettlement is not about taking as many refugees as possible. It is by giving an opportunity for female activists who stand up against Taliban. It may not be that the safest place for them to go is Iran or Pakistan, or a homosexual Congolese refugee in Uganda, where that is now punishable, possibly by death. So the people who cannot get protection, where most refugees are in neighboring countries, they are the ones we resettle. And that's where we should maintain that safety valve. The numbers are not high. And then we should treat refugees that come as asylum seekers on their own well, and again back to the return debate. But I think people generally think a reasonable share is something we can cope with. And it's essential for Europe to send that message to other countries that hosts the very many. Who are we to say we cannot handle 3,000 in Norway when we look at how many Lebanon has taken, how many other countries have taken, the generosity they have shown, and the whole survival of the logic of becoming a refugee. If you're not safe in your own country, the rest of us will step up.
Marta, we've mentioned the legal aspect of things, but what does research shows about how people make the decisions about returning to their countries of origin?
Thanks. I think we've touched on some of these aspects already when sort of thinking about how policymakers should think about this. I think, again, timing, family composition, age, life cycle are incredibly important factors that really shape very often how people think about whether they would return or not. Then I also think it's about family, relationality. We know that many societies that are, not like the Norwegian one, which tends to be slightly more nuclear and individualistic, are more collectivistic. And as I mentioned before, often remittances are an important picture in transnational family networks, whether they're refugees or not. And so considerations not just for myself, but for the broader circumstances of people around me who I maybe support and care for, have an obligation to, often tend to be part of that picture, which might mean that even if you as an individual would prefer to try to return, maybe your obligation is to stay where you are and stay safe, help that niece through school, earn that money and send those remittances. So I think this sort of aspect that it's not, rights are individual, but return considerations for many migrants and refugees included are very often not just about yourself, but about these broader considerations. And then I think an important aspect that we know from research is also that many people, of course, have contacts and information. With the internet, even more so. Before that, of course, as well, we had the radio, which was a fundamental source of information. People want to know whether it's a wise idea, whether it's safe, whether it's advisable to go, and also where to go. Because we talk about return as if it's, logically either just to that kind of dot on the map and as if that's automatically home somehow, or we sort of assume that they will go back to the house they left. But we know that in a context of war, chances are that house, that street may not longer be existing anymore, right? So I think this sort of idea that where you go back to also really matters. So considering where will you go if you're not staying where you are, for instance, in Lebanon or Jordan or wherever the case might be, where in Syria would you go back to? And again, we're back to relatives, contacts, networks. And the reason why this is important is that what we find in research among people who do return, both in context of post-conflict, but also more generally in migration, is that many of them experience return and the reintegration process after return almost as tough as the processes of integration in a new country. Sure, yes, they know the language, although in some contexts they may not know the language that is majority spoken in a particular area in the country. But yes, in Syria they would know the language. That the culture, they would have the same situation in terms of being ethnic or religious minorities or not. They kind of know this landscape quite well, although it's changed. But even so, a lot of people find that it's very tough because you've been away for long. Some people also experience that having been away while it's been tough positions you in a difficult situation vis-a-vis those who stayed and who suffered through the whole conflict. So there's a lot of challenges to return that are not at all about what happens in the kind of situation in Europe, but about what happens maybe after you've arrived. And so then the question would be, how do you gather information about this? You try via social media, talking to your friends, your relatives, your contacts, you try to reestablish. And all of these things will be incredibly important for making that decision, which really underscores what Pål was also mentioning, that there is a reason why there has been this emphasis earlier on return visits to see. And people have done that spontaneously, individually, and organized through the UNHCR. The IOM has also had programs to do with this. And we know that as soon as people lose agency and they're forced, so return is not voluntary and it's not dignified, it doesn't really work.
Pål, Marta, thank you very much. On January 25th, UN Refugee Chief Filippo Grandi announced that approximately 200,000 refugees had returned to Syria from neighboring countries since the government of Bashar al-Assad was overthrown. He also urged the lifting of Western sanctions on Syria, many of which were originally imposed on the regime but remain in place today. This episode was produced by Arno Siad and edited by Brage Pedersen, with sounds from the BBC and AFP. To explore PRIO's cutting-edge research, blog posts, policy brief, and events, visit prio.org.